Maraming salamat, Sir Francis. So magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. Ako po si Paulo Benedicto si Villar. Ako author ko po si Ma'am Patricia Camille Villar mula kami sa Politeknikong Universidad ng Pilipinas. So this is an ongoing research. Ang lahat po ng pagkukulang ay aming inaangkin. So ang titulo po ng aming talakayan ay From Mass Torturers to Politicians for the Masses, Distortions in the Remembering of Martial Law. So sisimulan po natin sa sino mga ba itong mga torturers na to. So in terms of shaping the torturers, di ba? In the discussion of Alfred McCoy in his book Closer Than Brothers, which focuses on the nuances of cadet life to command life of PMA Class 71, McCoy emphasizes how the PMA's pedagogy shaped these cadets to what they have become, torturers. So PMA pedagogy rested on an unchanging cycle of degradation to command. Torture is a learned behavior. Military training is marked by physical and psychological violence that serves as a gateway to torture. So from the Davide Commission in 1990, the hostile conditions undergone by the plebs and cadets in the academy have contributed to the hostilities towards a civil state. The emphasis on anti-communist sentiment rather than a pro-democracy has cultivated an uninviting appeal towards rightist authoritarian rule. At ito na nga ang authoritarian rule, di ba? So after years of planning, Marcos declares martial law. So ML formed new elite command units such as the 5th Constabulary Unit or 5th CSU and the Metrocom Intelligence and Security Group or MISG, both run by Fidel Ramos. The MISG in particular is the most favored torture unit of Ferdinand Marcos, with Rolando Abadilla as its commander. These units were armed with blanket arrest, search, and seizure orders, or the ASO. Hence, their freedom to simply raid homes and take in suspects to unknown locations for interrogations or safe houses. So the tortures. These units committed various forms of torture, like strangulation, water cure, Russian roulette, electric shock, psychological and emotional torture, burning, beating, pepper torture, sexual abuse, pistol whipping, San Juanico Bridge, animal treatment, to name a few. There are a lot more in terms of looking at the cases of human rights violations, but these are just a few. Diba? So the infamous torture units, the 5th CSU unit and the MISG, some notable members are Panfilo Lacson, who joined in 1971 right after his PMA graduation and what was part of the MISG for 15 years. Gringo Honasan, who rose up the ranks in the 5th CSU. Fidel Ramos, who was the chief of the Philippine Constabulary, supervising both units. So Juan Ponce Enrile, as defense minister, knew all about what was happening. And in the duration of our conference, various accounts have stated that in other parts of the Philippines, not only part of these units, there are other units that committed torture or other human rights violations. So aside from the 4, there are Rodolfo Aguinaldo, who was governor in Cagayan, post-EDSA and later held a congressional seat. Rolando Abadilla, who ran for governor in Ilocos Norte but lost. Roberto Ortega, who according to Alfred McCoy, bonded with Lacson over torture sessions. Other members would be Billy Bitbit, Vic Batak, who are also fellow RAM members accompanying Gringo Honasan. So the road to EDSA, the Armed Forces Movement, was formed as an alliance between then Defense Minister Juan Ponce Enrile and a clique of regular officers who were dissatisfied with the emerging padrino system within the ranks of the military, as Ferdinand Marcos seemed to favor General Fabian Ver and his close associates. The group eventually posed as defenders of human rights, contradicting the notoriety of the military and police as human rights violators. RAM managed to conceal its origins and aspirations as the media ignored its members' track record of human rights violations through uncritical coverage. This helped boost the image of RAM as reformers. So, leading to EDSA, the road to EDSA still, on February 2, In furthering their interests, they had planned a coup against Marcos on Feb 22 in 1986, but Marcos discovered the plot early on, and Enrile and Honasan sought refuge with Fidel Ramos. So within the day, Enrile and Ramos withdrew support from Marcos. Then you would see Enrile and Honasan going to going to Ramos, sorry. So this was the time Cardinal Sin appealed to the masses to block the impending carnage in the middle of the city. The remaining loyal forces of Marcos would be coming from Camp Bonifacio and would traverse EDSA, going to Camp Carame and Aguinaldo. So that's one of the facts that my students or students in general do not understand, why EDSA happened in EDSA. So that's it. Other than that, people power. So the historic event would culminate with what we know now as people power, which placed Cory Aquino as the new commander-in-chief. So Cory's revolutionary government did not sit well with the former torturers, now packaged as reformists. They launched coup after coup against Cory, which all failed. Aquino eventually established a fact-finding commission headed by Hilario Davide Jr. to investigate and provide a full report on the series of coup attempts against her government. So the commission cited these reasons for the coup based on the Davide Commission report. So firstly is the unaddressed military grievance, so namely the preference of the higher officials and the lack of promotion for the lower ranking officials. So second to be the objection to the inclusion of the left-wing or anti-military officials in the Aquino revolutionary administration or revolutionary government. Third, the opposition to peace negotiations with the communists and the Moro secessionist groups. Fourth, perceived loss of power which the coup plotters suffered as a result of the outcome of people power. Career dead end for senior coup plotters. And lastly, the messianic complex to save the Philippine society in the mindsets of these ramboys or in the mindsets of these coup plotters. So the question is, in a post-authoritarian regime, how do societies confront human rights violations committed by an authoritarian regime? So the article of Cohen, in terms of as a contribution to the justice in transition debate, provides these phases or discourses I have narrowed down into 4. It's not necessarily chronological in terms of 1, then 2, then 3, and 4, as in other regimes, they disregarded numbers 1 and 2 and established a de facto number 3, and in the interest of number 4. So in terms of number 1, the truth, it aims in establishing and confronting the knowledge of what happened in the past. The phase or discourse of truth is in the interest of accountability. It ideally seeks to confront or come to terms with the past. So it can be in the form of a truth commission. Such was the case in Latin America and South Africa. A lot of countries in Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, Guatemala, and others. In the case of the Philippines, it can be viewed as the creation of the Presidential Commission on Good Government, or PCGG, with the aims of recovering ill-gotten wealth, and the creation of the Presidential Commission on Human Rights, which is a precursor of the Commission on Human Rights. But progress was mainly achieved in the realm of wealth recovery, and the issues of human rights violations was shelved as the Cory administration still faced numerous coup attempts from the martial law mass torturers. So in the photo on the left is the CONADEP report, which is a 50,000-page report which the Argentinian National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons drafted or created. It was created with the encouragement and legislation by President Raul Alfonsín in 1983 to investigate the fate of the desaparecidos and other human rights violations performed during the military dictatorship between 76 and 83 or before his term. In our case, Cory and Ramos did not create any similar steps. They did not create any type of truth commission. For number 2, justice, it seeks to try to make offenders accountable for their past violations through either punishment through criminal law, compensation and restitution, or mass disqualification in government or in the office, such as lustration. Number three, it's impunity, or it is done in terms of canceling previous legal sanctions and or not to initiate any new ones against offenses committed during the previous regime. In short, it's exemption from punishment for the mass torturers, mass salvagers, mass executioners of the martial law regime by giving amnesty. So number four, it is in the interest of looking forward rather than backward. So the Aquino government and later the Ramos administration favored the latter two, number three and number four. So for the first phase or discourse of truth or the lack thereof in the case of the Philippines, what exists is a sort of social amnesia, which is forgetting by a whole society which separated itself from its discreditable past record. So it should also be stated that there are reports, such as the photos provided on the right side, released in 74 to Part 1, Part 2, 75, and 81, which have become a major source of historical documentation regarding torture under Ferdinand Marcos's regime, coming from Amnesty International. But there are also accounts coming from Task Force Detainees of the Philippines, the World Council of Churches, and others. Cohen mentions this in terms of acknowledgement. Acknowledgement is what happens to knowledge when it becomes officially sanctioned and enters the public realm, which did not happen in the Philippines. He adds that there is no need to state these new historical revelations in terms of documenting other cases, but what he cites is that what was needed was to convert the private information produced by the reports into official and public knowledge, sanctioned in short by the government. Diba? So the problem there is that there was no official and public acknowledgement of what happened in the past. So because of this, it became easier for people to cover up the record of atrocities and propagate historical distortions. Some would say that they did not know. Some would say that they saw nothing. And the all too familiar comment is that bakit nyo paniniwalaan yung mga professor sa UP na yan, di ba? So those things come up because from the point of view in terms of how authoritarian regimes transition, there is the lack of the Truth Commission, or there was no official and public acknowledgement of what happened in the past. And even the paglibing ni Marcos sa libingan ng bayani discredits all of the atrocities done in the past. Diba? So in the aspect of justice, in terms of punishments, none was doled out. It was only in the realm of compensation and restitution with the passing of, so I'll just zoom it. Hindi pala, okay na pala. RA 10368, so an act providing for reparation and recognition of victims of human rights violations during the Marcos regime, documentation of said violations, appropriating funds thereof, and for other purposes, signed February 25, 2013. So this was done after 27 years post-EDSA. Diba? So the photos are just showing the projects or plans of creating a human rights violations memorial museum by the Human Rights Violations Victims Memorial Commission. So just to give you an idea, it was enacted in 2013. In 2016, they, I think, formalized the last documentation of the cases. In 2019, they were literally forming their offices, physical. 2020, they are creating the website and they have published online the document, the list of people who filed for documentation. So in terms of facts, here are the facts. So the victims were interviewed and their stories documented. They were given restitution based on the device point system from 1 to 10. And in terms of the gravity, which is the highest would be 10, they would have a larger compensation or restitution. So, but sadly, this was 27 years too late. Well, still others welcomed the payment after so many years, while some just wanted to tell their story to prevent the recurrence of what happened. So again, what was needed was to convert the private information into official and public knowledge, which the HRVVMC did after 27 years. It's not their fault. So in the case of this 27-year gap of the lack of official and public acknowledgement of what happened created the space for deniers, created the space for historical distortionists, created the space for political opportunists. In the case of the mass torturers, the mass salvagers, and the mass executioners, they benefited much from this 27-year gap and the amnesty accorded to them by Cory and Ramos. So even longer than 27. So justice was not delivered. What reigned was impunity. So at the structural level, the reasons for impunity are often pretty straightforward. There is either no political will or resources to do anything about the past in terms of the context of post-EDSA. The army or security forces still retain enough power, openly or behind the scenes, or to threaten any attempt to render them accountable, which is very much obvious in the case of Cory and eventually Ramos. The current machinery then of law enforcement is intimidated, politically unwilling or corrupt, or technically inept of the succeeding regimes. So based from, I'll just read this, fragile democracies added by McCoy are susceptible to military coups and other destabilizing mechanisms. Hence, military rebels have the leverage to demand for amnesty for grave crimes. This leads to having more platforms to advocate for forgetting the past, thus altering the transcript of collective memory. So granting of unconditional amnesty secured these human rights violators from being persecuted for past crimes. Contributory to the collective oblivion of the excesses and abuses of martial law as torturers were never held accountable, but rather they managed to secure positions in civilian posts post-EDSA. The commission recommended, based from the Davide Commission, for the speedy and firm disciplinary action and or prosecution against members of the military in human rights violations, and that it welcomes the dispensation of justice. There should be no sacred cows. So that was the very very striking comment from the findings of the Davide Commission. But the report or the Davide Commission report fell on deaf ears in the case of Cory and eventually Ramos. Cory laid down what the framework for reconciliation and reconstruction was, which was contrary to the recommendations of the Davide report. So Carolina Hernandez would add that the comprehensive findings and recommendations of the Davide Commission were not taken seriously by the succeeding administrations. In grave particularity was the granting of unconditional amnesty for rebels and coup plotters by Fidel Ramos, contrary to the recommendations of capturing the identified renegade soldiers. Their capture, she adds, that their capture would have been vital in restoring the public's trust in the military, as the institution was perceived to have been protecting these coup plotters from being captured. So, in looking at how Cory laid down the framework for reconciliation and reconstruction, we can see that Cory disregarded the wisdom of the Davide Commission and laid down this framework of impunity in the name of unity of the Filipino people, which eventually Ramos continued in the subsequent proclamations that he granted, or the proclamations granting unconditional amnesty to various coup plotters, various mass executioners, various mass torturers, various mass salvagers, and other secessionist groups. So these opportunities accorded to the torturers enabled them to rebrand themselves from mass torturers, mass salvagers, and mass executioners to politicians for the masses, acquiring civilian posts in the cabinet, the legislature, and even the presidency. The renewed access to positions of power enabled them to soften the image of martial law by eliminating the main implementers from the grand picture and narrative of martial law. How can there be a crime if everyone is absolved of that crime? So how can then be resources if everything has not been officially and publicly documented by the state? So good examples would come from other Latin American countries into the effect of officializing and publicly acknowledging what has happened in the past. So their continued presence or their continuing presence in Philippine political life in the post-EDSA Republic dampens efforts in properly acknowledging that dark part of our history, even since the so-called restoration of democracy. So that is why we resound that never again and never forget. So maraming salamat po.